Hello, and thank you for taking time to watch this video. This is part one of a six-part analysis of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which many people, including myself, consider to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made. I originally intended to just make one big long video, but as you will see, things became quite complex and involved, so I decided to split it up into parts. As you're probably aware, there's a lot of people out there who believe that The Shining is not merely a horror movie, but a vehicle for Stanley Kubrick to send a message, to tell us something that he's not in a position to be candid about. I believe this is the case, and like many other people, I've been scrutinizing this movie to try to understand what it is Stanley Kubrick is trying to convey to us. I believe I've found some things of interest in this movie, and the purpose of this video is to share those things with you, and I hope it will be enlightening or at least interesting. I do want to say at the outset that during the course of gathering information for this video, I did have to rely on research done by other people, and I will try to reference them whenever possible, just because I want to give credit where credit is due. But I want to emphasize that the conclusions that I come to in this video are my own and do not reflect the opinion of anybody else. Instead of just coming right out and telling you what I think Stanley Kubrick is trying to convey to us, what I want to do is show you a message I believe he has embedded in this movie, and then, as it becomes necessary, explain what he's trying to do. So, with that, let us get started. For reasons which will become clear soon, I want to focus a little bit on the numbers 42 and 10. It has been pointed out by other researchers of this movie that these two numbers are significant in some way. For example, the very first time we see Danny Torrance, he's wearing a sweater with the number 42 on the sleeve. And then later on in the movie, Wendy and Danny are seen watching a movie on a television, which doesn't require an electrical cord, by the way, and this movie is called Summer of 42. Furthermore, on at least 3 different occasions, we see 6 cases of 7-Up stacked one on top of the other, and 6 times 7 equals 42. As for the number 10, at one point in the movie we see Dick Halloran watching a news broadcast where the number 10 is prominently displayed on 2 separate occasions. However, I believe that the most prominent references to the number 10 are made through the exit signs we see in this movie. Kubrick is constantly barraging us with exit signs everywhere we look. I've only included a few examples here, but the fact is they're everywhere you look in this movie. And the X in exit refers to the number 10, I believe. With this preliminary work out of the way, we're ready to get into the main part of this analysis, and I do want to point out that there is a PDF file you can download which closely follows what I'm going to go through here. It's not absolutely necessary, but as I've mentioned before, this analysis does get a little complex and involved, and it may be of help to you if you want to follow more closely and efficiently. I'm sure you remember that scene where Wendy Torrance is rifling through all those pages that her husband typed up, and she saw that he was basically insane and that he was typing the same thing over and over. If you recall, there seemed to have been hundreds of them, an entire ream of pages. However, the one page I want to focus on is the one that was in the typewriter, the very first page she looked at. Kubrick gives us 3 good looks at this particular page. An initial look, and then 2 subsequent looks as Wendy scrolls the page up through the typewriter. What I think is interesting to note is that when you look at these typewritten lines, it's evident that many of them have what appear to be typographical errors. What I mean is they deviate in some way from the standard all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. In these next 3 slides, what I've done is I've highlighted the typographical errors that you can see, and I've labeled the typewritten lines 1 through 22. You can peruse them at your own leisure, but what I'd like to do is focus on the following observations. More than half of the visible lines we can see contain a typographical error, which is significant considering that Kubrick was such a stickler for detail. Looking closely at views number 2 and 3, you can see that there's an extra empty line between the typewritten lines 9 and 10 and between lines 17 and 18. This would divide the 22 typewritten lines into 3 sections, which, as we shall see, is significant. Since dividing these lines into 3 sections seems to be Kubrick's intention, I've gone ahead and done so on the previous 3 slides. As you can see, I've divided these lines into 3 sections, sections 1, 2, and 3, and I'm numbering the lines according to the section and line that that particular line happens to be in. Also note that I am now counting the empty spaces in between the typewritten spaces. Recall our discussion previously about the significance of the numbers 42 and 10. It turns out that the phrase, "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," contains exactly 10 words. And furthermore, there are exactly 42 characters in this phrase, counting the spaces. I came across this observation thanks to the website below. It's very good and I highly recommend it. It contains very detailed analysis for the movie as a whole. Despite these connections to these numbers 42 and 10, it would appear that we just don't have a whole lot to work with at this point, just some typographical errors on a typewritten page. But keep in mind that Stanley Kubrick was one of the most precise, meticulous, and detail-oriented filmmakers in the history of cinema. I think it's entirely reasonable to look at these typos and assert that they must mean something. In particular, I want to focus on line number 7 in section 1. This line is interesting in that in the left-hand margin you can see there's a letter V there. Now, this letter can simply be a letter V, or it can represent the Roman numeral 5. This is an important distinction to make because if we take the position that this V represents the number 5, then the implication is that this particular line correlates somehow to line 5 in some other piece of work. And the main objective at this point would be to determine what book or piece of literature Kubrick is referring to. From this point, I tend to proceed with the assumption that this is the case, that this V represents the Roman numeral 5. And so what I want to do is I want to renumber section 1 to reflect that situation. I want to follow Kubrick's lead. If Kubrick is referring to this line as line number 5, then I want to do the same thing. Now, a potential downside to doing this is that the first 2 lines of section 1, as you can see, now no longer have a designation associated with them. This could turn out to be a problem. However, as I said before, I really want to do what Kubrick's doing. So we're going to proceed with this renumbering scheme with this in mind, And if it turns out that we, for some reason, need these first two lines, then we can reassess the situation. And just for the sake of completeness, what I'll do here is I'll show you the other two sections before moving on. So now the next step is to turn our attention away from the paper and the typewriter and towards the movie in general, with the idea of looking for any hints or clues that Kubrick may have given us as to what is the correlating book or piece of literature which goes along with this so-called V-line. With this task in mind, one can't help but be struck at the amount of books we see in the Torrance apartment at the beginning of the movie. There are books everywhere in this apartment, stacked on shelves, on tables. There must be literally hundreds of books just lying all around, all over the place. And really, when you stop and think about it, it borders on the absurd. It's as if Kubrick has done this intentionally. He's intentionally flooding us with dozens and perhaps even hundreds of potential candidates to look for. However, after thinking about this for a while, I believe the opposite is true. Because when we first see Wendy Torrance, she's reading a book. And not just any book, she's reading The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And I think the reason why Kubrick put all of these books all over the place in this apartment is to draw a contrast. That is, of all these books, Wendy Torrance is only reading this one book. And I want to point out that she's not just reading any edition of The Catcher in the Rye. She's reading the Bantam edition, which was published in the 1960s. It's out of print now, but there are a lot of these books floating around in used bookstores, which you could probably get if you want. Identifying The Catcher in the Rye as a potential correlating work to the typo page is really only half the battle. Now we are faced with the task of determining which page or pages in this book are the ones that correlate with the typographical error page. Now, something very interesting happens when you pay attention to this particular part of the movie. As Wendy is speaking with Danny, she puts the book on the table, and when she does so, you can see that one of the pages is dog-eared. It's marked. While it's not possible to make out the page number from the movie, one shining researcher in the YouTube video titled "The Catcher in the Shining" was able to identify that page by looking at the shape of the text. And he was able to determine that that page there is page 133. Therefore, that would mean that the page on the other side of that dog-ear mark there would be 134, and obviously the facing page would be 132. This is a very important discovery, because what we have here are 3 pages that Kubrick has called attention to. And recall that our typo page has been divided into 3 sections. That would imply that section 1 correlates to page 132, section 2 correlates to page 133, and section 3 correlates to page 134. Before proceeding any further, I want to pause and say that there are some encouraging clues from Kubrick that we're on the right track here. For example, in this clip, in the early part of the movie where Wendy is talking to the doctor, she makes the following statement.
Only about 3 months. We're from Vermont. My husband was teaching school there.
So Wendy tells the doctor that she is from Vermont, and it's striking to note that on page 132 and again on page 134, the word Vermont appears, as you can see here. And I do want to note that I have included these 3 pages in the PDF file, which you can download from the link below. Another example has to do with the word scream. As noted at the blog spot iscream237.ca, at this point in the movie, we see Wendy Torrance in a telephone room, and on the billboard is a piece of paper, and if you look very closely, it consists of the words "I scream." One could dismiss this as just some sort of simple play on words. However, if you take the point of view that Kubrick is telling you to look for the word scream, then it's very striking to note that this word appears on page 133, the dog-eared page we saw earlier. And furthermore, this is the only point in the entire book where this word appears. So we have these promising clues that Kubrick wants us to pay particular attention to these 3 pages. The next step, which we will do and which will be done in part 2, is to match or attempt to match the 3 sections of the typo page to pages 132, 133, and 134. And again, that will be done in the next part, part 2.